This afternoon's panel focuses on competition in the attention economy. So much of the attention on big tech has focused on what has become known as the attention economy. Broadly speaking, the attention economy refers to online services that people do not spend money to use, and instead they spend their time on these platforms, meaning that companies must compete for the finite resources that is people's time. But the lack of monetary payments creates difficulties for competition analysis. Typically, competition analysis uses prices as a key measure of how a firm's actions affect consumers. What do we do when the price is already zero? How do we define markets? How do firms compete for attention? And what, if anything, does that mean for policy? These, of course, are going to be some of the key issues that DOJ will have to address in the complaint that it released today, that it filed today. Before I continue, I want to note that relatedly, we'll be hosting a debate between Jason Furman and Josh Wright about the wisdom of creating a digital protection agency next Monday, October 26th at 2 p.m. Be on the lookout for an announcement to that. So, but we have a great and unique panel today to discuss competition in the attention economy. We've got the first person who ever wrote about the attention economy, a leading scholar on how people allocate their online attention, someone who has the actual detailed data on where people spend their time, a behavioral economist who studies how rationally people allocate their time and how that affects how companies should compete for it, and someone who has to figure out the answers to these questions in the real world. I'll let you figure out who's who. Remember to submit your questions on Slido, sli.do, in a browser window or your phone. Enter TPI Aspen 2020 in the event code field and just submit your questions. In the interest of time, I'm only going to give each person's title rather than their full bio, but I suggest you go look at their bio so you know you're getting really the best there is. Joining us are Ian Connor, who is director of the FTC's Bureau of Competition, Jeff Prince, professor and chair of business economics and public policy at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, James Muldrow, senior director of project management at Comscore, Kareen Rozen, associate professor and director of undergraduate studies at Brown University Department of Economics, and Varian, chief economist for Google. Thank you all so much for joining us. So the broadest question, of course, is how we should think about competition when firms compete for attention instead of money. So let's start maybe at the highest level. How do we think about relevant markets? Who would like to take that?
Well, I'll take a quick shot at it. In English, we pay attention. So that seems like we're paying for something that's scarce. It seems to be costly in some way, but other languages have different conventions. You give your attention in German. You make your attention in French and Italian. You lend your attention in Spanish, as in friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears. And you be attentive in Danish. It's a state of being. So all of these imply that it's something valuable, but some of them are more market oriented, like the pay, than let's say lend or give or be attentive, which I think is an important distinction across different languages and cultures.
So what does that mean for competition analysis?
So paying seems very much like competition, lending, giving, being attentive, etc., not so much. So it's not really a universal human requirement that you have a market for attention. You might have a market for attention, or it might be shared or given in some way. It depends on the context. We are more market oriented than other languages, I think, sort of an Anglo-Saxon issue there, but there isn't necessarily a market required for the attention concept.
And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking more from the analytical framework, attention, to the degree that attention has any function, it's really to assess how much somebody within a given market, or at least this is how, and I should start off with a disclaimer. I am speaking for myself. My views do not represent the views of any individual Federal Trade Commissioner or the Federal Trade Commission. So back to my answer, we look at how someone is lending, paying, giving attention for use of a particular product or within a particular market. So, and we would never typically define books as competing with social media, which is competing with movies, but they may all be competing for attention, my attention, at any given moment. I typically will review Twitter and read a book before I go to bed, but I wouldn't view them as competition from an antitrust standpoint. But what attention economy may be valuable in this non-price structure that you flagged at the beginning, Scott, is that we need some sort of metric to figure out what are market shares, who are the largest players in a market, who are the smaller players, and so that's where the attention analysis may come in. And you look at if you have say 10 million monthly active users that spend 1 minute of time on your service, is that 10 million users, or is somebody who has 1 million users that spend 10 hours a day on their service actively? How do you view those? Are they which one has the larger share? And so that's some of the things that we grapple with, especially as we're trying to look for different metrics where we don't have our normal kind of price or revenue measures.
So let me ask a little bit further on that. So you say that books and Twitter don't compete, which seems, of course, completely reasonable, and asserting that they do was probably pretty extreme. But then how do you decide where the line is? I mean, we normally look at cross elasticities. And what if it turns out that the more time people spend on Twitter, the less they spend reading? Are they still not in the same market? I mean, that particular comparison seems silly, but at some point they're not. And how do we decide when, what the role of an empirical analysis to try to identify the crowding out and crowding in is versus what sort of, I don't know, sounds right?
I think that there's an analogy to what used to be called the share of wallet. So when you went into a market, you had a supermarket, you would have, say, $100. And so we would hear sometimes arguments that cooking oil competed with, say, spaghetti, because I have $100, I have to allocate it among different food sources. Mm-hmm. And so those would all be considered within the same market. But as we have analyzed markets, what we look at is what are actually true substitutes. If I want to go in and buy cooking oil, and this is a case that the commission brought about 2 years ago, I'm not going to look at spaghetti, or I'm not going to look at baked goods as a substitute for cooking oil. I'm going to look at oils and select from the choices that give me the functional equivalent. When you're looking at some of the products that are out there now, there are things that look more like a search engine, or more like a social network, or more like a news subscription service than other things. So, for instance, search engines are not going to be necessarily a substitute for your Apple News feed. And so you may look at those things as operating in different markets, and the brown shoe factors and the guidelines and things that we have used for many years still come into play in terms of how we're going to define a market, even when we don't have kind of the price and elasticities that you may see in traditional economics.
So my understanding on the regulatory side is when you looked, or when the DOJ at least looked at media mergers, local newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, et cetera, the primary focus there was the market for advertising, particularly local advertising. So there you are moving to a place where there's clear substitution among these different media for advertising purposes. That's a natural way to focus these competition issues.
I mean, ultimately, all this competition for attention is basically to generate the advertising real estate. And, effectively, that's where the competition has the financial impact. Is there competition, over who you can advertise at?
That's certainly that's certainly a large aspect. I think advertising is a big driver of a lot of the decisions that are made, and how structurally we present digital media. But I think there's also it's an interesting concept, because when we think about attention, that sort of implies there's in some cases it's zero sum, as in I can't be attentive to multiple things simultaneously, which is an depending on where you stand on whether we can truly multitask, that both is and isn't an argument there, particularly on digital, because I can consume, I can have multiple tabs open of different things. I can listen to something while I'm reading, and on digital, both of those things I can count time against, or I can count advertising against, and have attention for them, as opposed to where the supermarket example that was given there. I can't necessarily simultaneously use two things for the same, I guess, general purpose that I am when I'm talking about digital media.
So you're bringing us closer to what people actually do with their time. And at Comscore, of course, you have all that information, and you know what people do. It means sort of broadly, where do people spend their time online, and have you seen changes either broadly or maybe even during coronavirus? And then after that, we'll go to Jeff, who's done research on how these things change over time too.
Sure, Scott. Definitely, I would say that the places that most people spend their time, when we're talking about just time, they tend to be focused on either content consumption for a specific purpose, like news or weather, or they're interested in social interactions like social media. Social media is a very large time sink for people when we look at digitally. Over time, that has shifted and in some cases merged, because social media in particular, it is a lot easier to make that to be a platform for other types of content, such as news. It is possible to, if you look at your Twitter feed, or you look at your Facebook feed, or you open a aggregator like an Apple News or Google News, those are places where you can both consume and interact. Facebook is probably the biggest example, or the most prominent example of that, but that's been a shift over time. And the other shift over time is that when you used to have separate buckets of places you might go digitally to consume content, like I might go to a news website, the website that is producing the content, that has also shifted in order to accommodate for the fact that there are other platforms where people are doing other things. And so that's why you see something like news being presented on a platform, on a social media platform like a Twitter or a Facebook or an Instagram or a Snapchat or any of these. And news organizations are putting their content there, and there is a certain segment of the audience that gets their news in that way exclusively, and doesn't get their news from going to the actual website of the content producer. So those are shifts that have occurred, and that's because the ecosystem has changed and there's greater availability of being able to do that.
Jeff, you've done a lot of work on this. What can you tell us about attention on the internet?
Yeah, so James certainly knows the Comscore data better than I do, but I have looked at various Comscore data sets on this. I think a couple points I just would like to add is, one is, Scott, you opened with a nice question about reading a book versus Twitter, and that seems like a unreasonable pair of substitutes. Although I think it immediately becomes more reasonable when you think about reading a long article on your smartphone versus going to Twitter, right? So I feel like there's this implicit assumption that we have to be thinking about attention within a certain ecosystem, like on your smartphone or your home computer. And that may be correct, but I don't know if that assumption necessarily always has to apply. The other thing, at least for me, is when I was thinking a lot about the attention economy, one of the things as we got started in this research is just realizing that there's a lot we don't know in terms of just general behavioral patterns, which I think can be really helpful in trying to understand, what are substitutes in various possible markets here. And so we looked at, just trying to capture ideas like, breadth and depth of attention. So thinking about how people spread their attention over different, types of consumption, when you think about home internet is the way we looked at it at first. And then thinking about when you go somewhere, how long are you there, right? So we call that the depth of your attention. And one of the interesting things we found, now this is a little bit of a while ago, but the stability of it over such drastic changes in the period, I think is pretty striking. So we looked at 2008 to 2013 and the distribution of people's breadth and depth of attention and found that it was incredibly stable, that distribution. But this is in the aggregate, so it could be changing person to person, of course, and I'm sure it is in some instances. But I think it's pretty telling to see the kind of the aggregate patterns be quite stable. And one of the things we suggest—
And Jeff, just sorry to interrupt for a second. When you say in the aggregate, do you mean were your categories sort of as large as social media versus news, or were they what kind of categories were people stable across?
Right. So yes, in those broader categories. So not getting down to kind of the micro levels. So it's more, you know, we recognized there was a lot of change in the specific places that people went, but in terms of, you know, the general distributions, there was a lot of stability there. And so one of the things that, you know, I think might be a takeaway from that is there might be some stability in, you know, how people prefer to allocate their time. And so then they're just looking for things to fill in those slots. And so, you know, it's thinking about, you know, do I watch a movie or do I spend, you know, an hour reading the news, as opposed to, you know, carving up an hour that I intended to do one thing into maybe 4 or 5 smaller things.
I think one thing to keep in mind also is that a category of things people may be deciding to do is just screen time, and that there's more complementarity between the services than we're really accounting for, right? You learn about something through Facebook, you Google that, you know, that informs your response, right? You get into a Twitter fight and you comment on that on Facebook. So all these things, the notifications, the fact that you're already on the phone, you now more easily look at something else. In that sense, playing sports is a far more cutting substitute that doesn't have that feedback with the other products. But I mean, going back to something Hal said that I think was very interesting, there's different ways we talk about giving attention, but all of them have this common theme that it's very costly. And so in that sense, we want to think about attention as, you know, kind of like a price. But the big difference that we have to take into account is that attention has a price which is very subjective, and it's very, very hard to measure it. And one of the things I work on is like testable implications of attention, because we don't see people pay, right? It's super subjective. And as a result of that, you know, things that have been proposed to sort of study what are the right markets. So for instance, Tim Wu suggested this really neat idea of an attentional sniff, which I think has a lot of value. But at the same time, we have to maybe still adjust, because it's really hard to define what it means to, you know, increase the costs of somebody's attention. We don't actually know, you know, that when you play a video that's longer and longer, we don't know people are paying attention to it. We don't know what they're doing that time. Maybe they're using that time for other useful purposes. So we can't actually be sure how much attention people are paying unless we go into the realm of like eye tracking.
There's a lot packed into that answer. So could you maybe say a little bit more about how people or what you found about how people make decisions, and you know, when they make decisions, I'm probably not asking this the right way, but when they make decisions rationally and irrationally, and what they're influenced by?
They're influenced by a lot of things, Scott. So we all make, you know, decisions thinking they're rational, and our plans typically are somewhat rational, except that we're not necessarily good at predicting our future behaviors in response to stimuli. We get, you know, nudged by things in ways we don't expect. We have, you know, not as good skills in controlling ourselves, willpower as, you know, we might think. And so all these things affect what we actually do in relation to what we think we're going to do. And these can be issues, right? You on TikTok, you are swiping videos for a few seconds here and there, and you think no time is passing by, and suddenly the entire 40 minutes you're supposed to do something important has gone. So our perception and our realities can be divergent.
Hal, what do you think about that all, including whether people's attention has been relatively stable over time in categories, and what you can infer about the way people make decisions based on the data that you can see at Google, which of course I know you can't really tell us about, but do these sort of trends and sound like what you all see?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, if you make the categories broad enough, it's certainly true. If you look at entertainment as a category and travel as a category, et cetera, then people, to the extent they're taking about the same number of trips at one time than another, not now, of course, but generally speaking. And you look at entertainment, people are spending time on entertainment. But there has been a big shift, a really very noticeable shift between TV and online, because all these video services that are available now have eaten into the TV market for sure.
So DOJ's complaint seems to imply, and of course I've skimmed this, incredibly detailed manner, but it seems to imply that defaults or inertia are more responsible than anything else for getting people's attention. Is that a plausible assertion? And if I'm summarizing the complaint wrong, I apologize. I've had 5 minutes to look at it, but who needs more than that? But so what is that? What are the effects of inertia and defaults? Who'd like to take that?
Well, I can certainly say from the perspective of data that we've seen, as well as I was like my own personal experience, is that when defaults change, at least when the user is presented with something that they do not have to adjust themselves, that they are whether that's your new phone has a native app that is opening available when you first have the phone versus something that you have to download, that garners with it a certain level of interaction, and that doesn't necessarily change over time for a certain segment of the population of the user base. There are some that will definitely shift over to something that is more customizable that they might find on their own, but a lot of times the defaults are used, and at least when we at Comscore are really looking at the trends over time, when a default changes, that does cause changes. At least we do see changes in the overall user base for whoever the default is or isn't.
Yeah, I would say there are plenty of counterexamples to that. If you look at Google search, Google was a little search engine among many back in 1998 when it started, and it was better than the others. I think that's widely agreed, because they had better technology and better ideas, and it caused a lot of people to switch. And then if you look at Chrome, same thing. Chrome was nothing, and then it was released as a browser, competing in a pretty competitive offerings from different browsers, and it did very well. So you have to be significantly better than the alternative. I mean, if you've got the same thing on a new product as an old product, it's not going to get much switching. But if you really offer something that's different, then people will switch.
Yes, and I wasn't suggesting that superior product offerings can't garner switching power. My view was more at the onset of when someone has a new product that's coupled with something else.
Right. And by the way, there's also a considerable amount of multi-homing, that people use multiple search engines. Particularly, there's a very nice table in the CMA, the Competition Market Authority report, showing how many people spent time on different search engines over the course of the month, and it's quite telling. Now, people have their favorite or their one that they use most often, but if they don't find what they're looking for there, they look at others. So the people are aware of the kinds of alternatives that are available. They just choose one to be their favorite.
So we find some stuff that I think is at least suggestive in terms of inertia. So just going back to this kind of concentration measure that we have, even if you look at the site level, our measures indicate pretty high concentration in terms of if you measure it by time. So if you look at all the sites, so if we're looking at, just as an example, if you look at home PC usage, you look at the sites and then do shares by time, concentration metric is pretty significant. I think it was around like 2,900 was what the HHI would be if you calculate it like shares. So it suggests, it's relatively concentrated for the average person in terms of where they spend their time. Now, is that proof of inertia? Not necessarily, but I think that's kind of an interesting relatively high concentration metric. And I'd also seen other analyses suggesting that when you go to mobile devices, people tend to go to 5 different sites is I think like the median. So it does seem to be relatively concentrated where people go and at least spend their time. But again, that doesn't necessarily prove inertia, but it's somewhat suggestive evidence.
Let's talk about two-sided markets and whether that matters at all. Kareen already mentioned mentioned the issue of advertisers, and advertisers have to choose where they want to go. How does that figure in here when we're thinking about the role of attention? Advertisers need consumers to pay attention to their ads, and so the platforms need consumers to pay attention in order to click on the ads. How does that figure into thinking about competition?
So these are two-sided markets, right? One side is kind of a standard market, the advertisers pay money. The other side of the market is like basically, I don't know how else to call it, but like a barter economy where you trade, your attention, possibly your personal data, and you're getting the service from the company. So the question is what side you care about the competition on. Are you looking for improving consumer welfare, getting similar functionality that's better, or are you interested in the competitive side on the advertising? This can be a judgment call. It looks like the House report has more to do about improving consumer welfare from the side of getting similar but better functionality. But you could be interested in both sides.
Yeah, I think it's important to observe that in lots of cases, the advertising is fulfilling an informational need. People go type in sushi near me because they need some sushi. And what happens is you see these ads, we see maps, you see opening hours, you see menus, you see all this great stuff, and that's going to help you make a decision. And in fact, I think people look down on ads a little bit, but the typical ad conveys much more shopping-related information than the organic result. For example, these ads, like product listing ads, they're required to have a price there. Whereas with regular AdWords, you are required to have a price. And we all know from the economics literature that when companies are able to do price-based advertising or advertising price as part of their offering, prices tend to be a lot lower. That shows up for alcoholic beverages, it shows up for opticians, it shows up for lawyers, it shows up across the board. And online, it's not just that you're able to quote a price, it's mandatory to quote a price in those product listing ads and other ads of that sort. So that's a big, big help for consumers.
Ian, you were about to say something.
I was going to say, I think you actually need to look at both sides of the market, because one side of the market, to Kareen's point, is the way in which the other side of the market may be monetized. And so to understand why actions are side of the market, you need to understand what benefit that may achieve on the other side of the market. So, or detriment. So maybe fewer, from a quality metric, fewer ads in your news feed may be something that users find attractive, but obviously it has a revenue impact on the person providing the service for free on the user side. So you need to understand basically why they do what they do on one side, and how they either lead to effects or lead to attractiveness on the other side. A very large user base that spends a lot of time on that particular site is likely going to be more attractive to advertisers. Similarly, advertisers are going to be drawn to advertising where they think that they're likely to get a high hit rate. So if there are smaller numbers of ads, but they garner more attention, that may be more attractive to advertisers. So they're interrelated, even though in many of these they're not simultaneous transactions like you saw in the Amex case that came down from the Supreme Court a couple of years ago.
Well, one thing that I think is very important to recognize is when you go for advertising online, the user has more control. So look at YouTube. There you've got TrueView ads where it says you can close this ad after 4 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever. And that's a capability, of course, you didn't have with TV commercials. And same thing when you look at product listing ads, you see this little carousel and you can scroll to the left and see more ads if you want, or you can see less ads. It's up to you. So the users really like having that control. They might seek the information that comes from the ads, like the product listing ads or the YouTube ads, but they like the fact that if they're not interested in that information, they can zip right through it.
So actually, how does Google decide how long people have to wait before they can click through an ad?
That's
I
really,
assume it's analytical somehow.
well, it's a choice from the advertiser makes. I mean, and specify that. And of course, if you want the full thing, you can get it. But then again, people might not find that ad as attractive. And it might be a lot easier to have a less expensive ad that people can click away from. Because look, I don't want a customer to come to me if they aren't interested in buying my product. So I want an engaged customer. Customer goes out of their way to click on the ad.
So that's part of the ad auction is how long they think a viewer will watch before clicking away versus wanting them to see as much as the ad as possible. Is it something like that?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, advertisers can experiment with different products. It'll be a different amount of time. They can try different things out and see which one works best for them. And that's really the only sensible way to do it, because we don't have at this point a great theory about about what it should be. So we really have to do experiments to find out what's right for this particular product.
Have we seen changes in how willing people are to look at ads over time? I mean, first, the 90s and 2000s, we got the banner ads that were incredibly distracting and nobody ever liked, and they've become more sophisticated, and companies have to continue innovating in how to attract people's attention. And has that translated into different willingness to pay attention to advertisements? Or is it always increasing competition for really the same propensity to watch ads, or people's willingness to watch a given amount of advertising?
Well, I would say for many cases, advertising is an inferior good in the sense that hot dogs are an inferior good. The more wealthier I am, the fewer hot dogs I consume. And Netflix, Amazon Prime, Google Play, all of these subscription-based services have really taken off in a phenomenal way. If you just compare what we can see now, the set of choices available to us in terms of video entertainment, to just 10 years ago, it's huge. It's been a huge, huge change. And people are quite willing to pay these fees of $9.99 or $10 a month, something like that, to have that choice. So they're paying in part to avoid the ads.
When we're talking about video, that's certainly true. And I guess there's also a distinction that would probably, Scott, given your question, which would probably be made between, I guess, viewability as far as did the user see the ad versus are they paying attention to the ad, and that's been definitely a question mark, and one of the reasons why you opened up with saying, you remember with the banner ads, which still exist, but they became quite numerous, and there was a lot of consumer pushback about that. It's like too many banner ads, but then advertisers and content producers became responsive to that and made it in some cases less prominent and less obvious, but something like a an in-feed ad that is looking similar to the content that you're trying to produce, but is sponsored and clearly shown as an ad, but doesn't detract as much from the user experience as really taking the user out of it by splashing in front of them a very wide banner. So there's a difference between viewability and, I guess, desire to view, and how that plays into your propensity to use the service, whatever it is that you're using.
Hal, let me ask a question about this is kind of a long-term incentive question. So, on the one hand, Google needs people to pay attention to advertisements. On the other hand, you've said in the past that really the goal of search is not to present people with 1,000 results, but to give them the answer to the question that they need and send them on their way. Do you all debate that that tension? Is it not close enough to reality that it really is a tension yet?
So I think it's going to take a change in user behavior to really make that happen, because what happened is, suppose you take a query like frying pan, okay? Frying pan. Do you want to buy a frying pan? Maybe. Do you want to see pictures of frying pan? Do you want to look at the history of frying pans? Do you want to see what the best equipment is for your kitchen, et cetera, et cetera? And if you look at the search results, just do a search like this and look at the search results, you will see there are results for each of these different things. There'll be pictures of frying pans, there'll be ads for frying pans, there'll be history of frying pans, and so on and so on. So nowadays, with language recognition, as good as it is, you want to ask broader or longer questions that really specify what you're looking for. You go to Google and you don't just say frying pan, you should say, I'm interested in buying a new frying pan, or what's the history of frying pans in China, and on and on and on. And you will get really fantastic results if you qualify your query sufficiently.
Let's try to start working in some of the audience questions, because they're piling up here. Actually, I'll first start with a question from Mike Nelson, who used the Q&A on Zoom. Mike, go to Slido. But let me just read it. So it says, a few years back, Robert Lighton gave a provocative talk on how microeconomists saved the online dating business. They helped dating sites redesign their services so users were forced to contact only prospects they were really interested in meeting. Are there lessons to be learned there? Can websites force users to reveal more of their preferences? Can that help identify better news and other content rather than the most anxiety or dopamine gathering? Maybe Kareen, you could start with that, since you try to figure out how people think, if I put that most broadly as possible.
Well, it's really hard to tell what we mean by better for people, right? People's preferences can be somewhat malleable. So are we trying to find out what they think they want, what we would like them to want, that they might like if they actually see? So this is a difficult question. I do believe that these websites are already getting quite a bit of personal information from people without them realizing it. I do think people value their privacy, and I don't know if they would willingly want to reveal more is the challenge here.
So is it a tension between whether they willingly want to reveal more and the desire of sites to get them to reveal more?
Yes. So, you're looking at who people might be talking to. You're looking at, what ads they click on. You're already looking at what searches they do. People often aren't that happy about that information being used, or they may not be cognizant of it. But in order to get better information about them, you might have to ask them. And I think there's a tension right there.
So this is really a question about how you can measure or take advantage of intensity of preferences. Take advantage of has the wrong connotation, because if somebody prefers something more strongly, you would like to deliver that. Is there any work on or thought on trying to incorporate intensity of preferences in I don't know, search results, or Mike's question of dating results, and anything else in terms of attention. People multi-home, and so you want to get them to focus on one platform instead of another. If they're multitasking, you might want to try to draw their attention away from one activity to another. Has there been? I mean, I'm not really aware of work on this. And thinking about how it might interact with competition policy, because it does seem to introduce another margin.
Well, there are many metrics. Google is said to have roughly 200 metrics, and it all depends on how you count. These are a third. People have said something along those lines, or 200, and some of them are things like deliberate revisits. So I actively choose to revisit a site, maybe by direct navigation. That's a pretty solid sign that's something that I'm interested in. And if I'm interested in it, then people like me are interested in it, and people like them are interested in it. So if you look at the number of people that are engaging in some costly activity, like typing in a URL, that's a pretty good signal they're interested in what's at the other end. And there are many signals like that, bounce rates, dwell time, on and on and on.
Jeff, have you tried to incorporate or think about how you might incorporate intensity of preferences? I see you're laughing, wishing that I hadn't asked you that.
No, it's you got me thinking back some old headaches in putting some of my research together, because those are exactly the kinds of questions we would get with, if you think about where the research is, on the academic side. I think still a lot of it is just looking at time. We get data on, you had your smartphone on this website for this much time, or you had your computer at this website for this much time. And inevitably you get the questions of, how do you know that person was really engaged when they were at that site? And I think Kareen made this point, we'd almost have to be where we're, actually doing some, assessment of where are your eyeballs, right? So what are you actually paying attention to? So I think that, I guess, unfortunately, my answer, at least from anything I've done, is I don't have anything great as of now, but I think it's becoming an increasing issue, because I imagine everyone here, and probably everyone watching this, has, had multiple devices active simultaneously, and certainly we're not paying full attention to both simultaneously. And I think that's increasingly the case. Every evening I've got my smartphone out, I got the TV on, and who knows what else, right? And I'm shifting attention all the time. But I think Hal's point is a good one. There's a lot of ways to measure direct engagement, but from the research side, it's more data that would allow us to have those kinds of metrics would be super helpful in trying to dig in deeper.
And remember, it's important to keep in mind that this is a two-sided matching, as we heard before. Google also looks at the websites, and they want to say, does it have high page rank? Lots of people link to it. Is it well organized? Is it clean structure? Does it load quickly? All sorts of things that have to do with the characteristics of the website are also part of this matching issue, not just the user's interest, but the website's quality, in a broad sense of quality.
Speaking a little to Jeff, your point about having the scenario of I have attention potentially split across multiple devices. At least one of the things that from the measurement space, when we're trying to do the type of measurement that Comscore does, we have certainly advanced a lot in the deduplication of the fact that you are using multiple devices. Now, we have not, I don't think we've taken it to the level of where we're trying to look at, say, stitching together timestamps to say simultaneous usage in order to try to understand whether your attention may have actually literally be split between two instances that we're seeing of the back end of connected activity. But that's potentially an area of exploration where we could try to understand whether in the face of multitasking, how much multitasking or attempts at multitasking are there actually in a confined finite space of time, as opposed to, we know generally people are using this device and this device to get similar content or different content. So something for us to explore.
I'd be very interested.
So here's it's a simple question, but probably a difficult one to answer. It's for, I think mostly for Ian. Are antitrust agencies using the concept of attention market in their analyses? So it sounds like a yes/no question, but I'm sure it isn't.
So, and this actually gets back to the very first answer that I gave. And we look at different metrics to understand how people use products. And most often when we try and calculate shares or calculate the value that is accorded to certain products, we will look at how much they pay for it, or how much revenue a company generates in terms of trying to figure out what their share is and what their market presence is. When it's free, there are no revenues, and so we look for other metrics. But that's not necessarily unique either, because when you talk about consumer welfare standard, we do look at other metrics even beyond price. We look at say in hospitals, we look at how many patients you serve, how many procedures you do, what is the quality. There are quality measures that we look at in healthcare. So in the digital space, where we're looking at potentially the attention as being the primary kind of value or the primary thing that people are trying to attract to then sell to advertisers, we look at things like monthly average usage, daily average usage, how much time somebody spends on a given app or a given website. Because where we don't have kind of that monetary calculation that we can look to, or other quantifications, that's a good idea of how much market share they have.
Is attention zero sum? And I know we have multitasking and so on, but just because you're spending your time on two things doesn't mean you're the actual somehow measured attention you're using is twice as much if you're using two sites. How do we think about that?
There's a lot of work suggesting that how much people even think about a problem depends on their incentives, right? So it could look like you're paying attention for a certain amount of time, but you could be more or less actively paying attention. It could be that, doing two things at once, if you put enough effort into it, it's just as good, but more likely it's probably not just as good. I would still argue that the attention is not zero sum here, just because one of these things draws you to do the other as well. I mean, it's true that time spent on Twitter is not time spent on Facebook, but they have a lot of complementarity in that they keep you on the screen. You're still getting notifications. You're still thinking about, did you get a like on this? So these, in that sense, are not exactly zero sum.
Think about juggling. Difference between juggling one ball and then two balls, and then you've got this sort of jump at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there you have to cut your attention in a way that enables that particular task, and any other thing that's like juggling, your schedule or your appointments, etc.
So advertisers must take this into account in their auction bids, in the auction when they bid for advertising space. Do you think it's possible to pull from auction data how much people discount multitasking, Hal?
Well, I'll tell you one very interesting thing about online advertising, and for that matter, any kind of advertising, is there's a big spillover. So if you advertise your hotel, the other hotels in that ad or in that section are going to get a boost as well. It's particularly true in Las Vegas. When a new casino opens, what happens to the visitors to the other casinos? And the answer is they go up, because there's this ad showing a casino in Las Vegas, and people might call up and try to get an appointment. It turns out they're full, so they say, well, that looks like fun anyway, and they'll go to another one. Same thing if you look at banner ads, or there's a nice report from Yahoo about this. They see the clicks on other ads go up when a new advertiser shows up in the ranks. In automobiles, most of the TV networks have a deal with the automakers that they'll only show one auto ad per pod. Why? Because people can't tell the difference between one auto ad and the other. So it's something where they really want to get your undivided attention.
Another question, does an attention market also include the physical world? What about time spent walking around a retail store or seeing a billboard on the road? How do we mix online time and real world time?
Well, think of dollar stores. Dollar stores are there because you don't have to walk around Walmart. Basically, that's what they're selling, the convenience of getting this product without having to go into this big, difficult environment. Or look at a toaster. I buy a toaster so I don't have to watch my toast. I let it do it. And, read the newspaper, don't devote my attention to.
If you watch your toast, it will never get done, of course. We know that.
Won't be burnt if it is done.
Right. And how does it, in the various analyses and investigations you've seen, when is an investigation likely to take into account online and offline time, as opposed to just one or the other?
So I think it would depend on what the market you're looking at is. I would be skeptical of viewing a situation in which we would accept an argument that my offline time competes with my online time, and so the market shares, say, of my news service on my phone, it should actually be downgraded because I'm reading a newspaper. I think that they're very different from an antitrust standpoint. The best example I can come up with is I usually put on a podcast when I have to do the dishes and clean the kitchen. I would not consider dishwashing as a functional equivalent or a replacement for the podcast.
So do podcasts cause dishwashing?
I think dishwashing may cause podcasts, at least in my house. But so I don't see how, from a antitrust standpoint, when we're trying to figure out market share and things like that, they're not substitutes. Getting back to that very first answer, I just don't view them as the same thing. But the podcasts may compete with podcasts on, say, the Apple podcasts may compete with podcasts on Spotify, because I have both apps and I can switch back and forth there, and they provide the same a functional equivalent. So those I would see. Do I spend more time on the Apple site versus do I spend more time on the Spotify site getting that same function? Those would be where I would look at the attention differences in the attention share.
So going back to the questions and kind of combining a couple of them, given that, what kind of tools can we use to define the markets and separate and really determine what competes with what activities compete with other activities? Because, like we said earlier, a cross elasticity analysis might find a result that doesn't pass the smell test. But without these empirical tools, what do we do? How do we manage this? How do we put these two things together?
Well, there's work on brand recall, for example, and aided brand recall, unaided brand recall. So in a lot of cases, you want to know, is the consumer aware of these other possibilities? I drink Coke, but I know there's such a thing as Pepsi. And in fact, I could even pick up a 6-pack of Pepsi at the supermarket if I wanted to. I know exactly how to do it. I just prefer Coke, okay? And there are many products like that. It shows up in online products or once or another. I prefer this news service or this weather service rather than that one. So normally the cross elasticity is not always what you want. Sometimes you just want to know, are people aware that there are alternatives to this product?
And to that particular point, you don't need necessarily elasticities and econometrics to figure out whether or not Coke and Pepsi compete, or various other products that you can get in the market. And if I want cookies, then frozen pie is probably not going to be a substitute. And I don't need necessarily economics to tell me that. And that's go back to a Supreme Court case, Brown Shoe. They actually lay out these factors and they looked at substitutability, but they also, one of those factors is perception and recognition within the marketplace that these are distinct entities. And so I still think those are valuable things to look at, because especially now where you do have some people moving back and forth between different apps or different platforms, there's still going to be a recognition that certain things look like other things, and are a distinct set from, say, to use an earlier analogy, sports. That's going to be a very different set from a social network or a newsfeed.
I personally love the idea that different desserts are not substitutes, and I will try to use that later. But my wife will have a different opinion on what on that question, what I can eat. So let's go back to Mike. Mike Nelson followed up in Slido. Thank you, Mike. And he said, follow up to a question on dating sites. For many sites, there seems to be a tension between the user's desire to get quick answers and the need for time on site. Right, so sometimes you want something as quick as possible. How does the site, but the site may want you to spend as much time as possible there. How do they deal with that?
Well, I'll jump in here. If you look at the question of getting answers as quick as possible, this has become something of a sore point, because people are saying, oh, it used to be you would show me lists of weather sites and I could click on one. Now you just show me the weather. Or it used to be that when I asked what the melting point of Mercury is, I clicked on a link and got an answer in Wikipedia or something. Now it's just there. So search engines in general are becoming more like answer engines. When you ask a question and there's a resource on the web that has exactly the answer that you're looking for, then our view is to show them that answer. But some information providers are not so keen on this solution. They don't want to be bypassed, but we think it's in the best interest of the consumer to get the answer as quickly as they can. So you're seeing more of these kinds of searches and answers rather than just searches and web links.
I also want to say that I think there's maybe less of attention than you might think, because for economists, we would call this, a repeated game. You have this repeated interaction between the customer and the provider. And if they make it too annoying, myopically, maybe they're better off myopically. But if you think about needing the customer to come back after that, take the entire stream into account.
That's a good point. Here's another question that sort of takes this into a slightly different direction. The tech makes our attention more effective, smarter recommendations. So it's not zero sum. Is this a moving target? Can we have innovation in attention? Is that possible? Any thoughts?
TikTok.
Yeah.
I mean,
people say that made attention worse.
Yeah, it could be. It's pulling your attention away from some things and focusing them on TikTok and the occasional ad that floats by as well. But a lot of these things, I got to say, when I first heard about Twitter, that you had this, 40 characters or so, or 140 characters, I said, oh, come on, you got to be kidding me. But here it's become a very viable, important service. TikTok was the same way. I just didn't think that the short form video really had a lot of promise, but I was wrong.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out its appeal, but clearly not the audience. So.
I mean, Scott, I guess I could also see recommendation systems fitting into this, right? So,
yes,
better recommendations allows me to spend my attention more efficiently. I'm trying to find things that, cater to my tastes instead of me, wandering aimlessly, trying to figure it out. The more you can identify, what really hits the spot for me, my attention is used more efficiently. So then I have more attention to give to other things. So I think that's also a fruitful area.
James, this is not a fair question because it's a very specific data question. But do you think do you see that in the data that people are spending more time on recommendation engines? I guess I'm not exactly sure how we would define that precisely. But is there some evidence for what Jeff said? And I totally admit this is not a fair question because it sounds like a huge research project.
I would say it is. It is a huge research project. I think thinking about what recommendation engine really means, because as has been pointed out, the evolution of of say a simple search might go to a recommendation, and that's a product evolution of what is being offered. We do certainly see that the usage of I'll use search engines because that's the easiest thing to sort of see as an evolution to a recommendation engine. The usage from search is certainly not diminishing, as in, it is, even if search is more efficient, you're not necessarily, you're searching for more things now because perhaps you've answered your one question, but people don't just have one question. So to answer, if there's some evidence to indicate that, and I say evidence just because of the stability and the fact that we spend just as much time doing just more searches now, that gives me more recommendations or more ability to answer more questions. I don't know anyone that has run out of questions to answer for themselves. Let me put it that way.
I've actually noticed recently, Google seems to sometimes provide a box that says, we can't find any good answers for your question. I've never seen that before. Is that new? Why did they decide to put that there?
Yeah, that's a relatively new feature, but what it's suggesting to you implicitly is try doing a query refinement. That is, here you've got your query. And I think this is one of the bullet points on that screen. It says, try rewording it, or something like that.
Yeah.
But,
I actually thought I was so smart I'd ask something the internet didn't know, but turns out I'm just a bad writer.
Yeah, well, and the spell checkers improved too, so.
Yeah. Here's a question. We're running out of time, but question, it looks actually sort of tailor-made for Kareen here. Any observations about dark patterns and the ways sites confuse users and get them to buy things they didn't intend to buy? Gilbert calls this confusopoly.
Good term. There's always a history of nudging in marketing. The whole point of marketing and advertising is to make people realize they need something that they didn't realize they needed. So I don't think anything is really new there. They do have more personalized information, right? But in the end, it's a matter of how paternalistic we want to be about people's choices. And that's it's a hard decision to make. It's not a black and white answer.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, one thing that we haven't talked about thus far, but I think is quite important, is the distinction economists make between persuasive ads that are trying to persuade you of something. If I use this deodorant, my sex appeal will go up. That's a persuasive ad. If you're looking for how to find something, on the other hand, or you're looking for a specific product description, then you might see informational ads. And generally, economists think informational ads, those are definitely good, but these other ads, these persuasive ads, they're a little iffy. And by the way, if you look at the internet, of course, it's ideally suited for the information ads, where you look at TV and you look at glossy magazines and this kind of thing. They tend to be much more on the persuasive side.
One last quick question before we go. This is not about the attention economy per se, but not everybody knows the ins and outs of how DOJ and FTC works. So Ian, why is DOJ bringing the complaint against Google instead of the FTC?
So we have a shared jurisdiction, and so both the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ can investigate and, if they choose, based on evidence, prosecute cases. We have what's called a clearance process. where in order to protect our finite resources, we typically have one agency or the other investigating cases. And so usually gets divided up between them, given the fact that we are not blessed with unlimited resources and unlimited personnel. So we have to focus our resources. And so one agency or the other will investigate things.
Okay. With that, I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us and talking about this issue. It's complicated and very interesting, and there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you all very much. And tomorrow we will be focusing on China, starting at 12:25 Eastern time. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Scott, and
Thank
everybody else.
you.
Thank you.